In the months after the war ended, Allied intelligence officers conducted thousands of interrogations with captured German generals and staff officers. These interviews, preserved in the Foreign Military Studies collection at the National Archives, revealed a surprising pattern. When asked which Allied forces they considered most dangerous, German commanders gave answers that defied expectations. The British were described as professional and methodical. The Soviets were acknowledged as relentless and willing to absorb staggering casualties. But when discussing the Americans, German officers used words like unpredictable, aggressive, and terrifying. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, writing in his private papers later published after his death, recorded an observation about American forces that surprised everyone who read it. After initially routing American troops at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, Rommel noted that the tactical conduct of the enemy defense had been first class. He wrote that the Americans had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up the German advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points. This was not faint praise from a man being polite to defeated enemies. This was a professional soldier recognizing something unexpected and potentially dangerous. The Americans had been beaten badly, but they had not broken. They had started adapting even as the battle was still raging. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced commanders and the mastermind behind the Ardennes offensive, was captured at the end of the war. When Allied interrogators asked which American commander had most impressed him, von Rundstedt reportedly replied that Patton was their best. This assessment would have seemed absurd just 2 years earlier. When American forces first encountered German troops in combat, the results were nothing short of catastrophic. The transformation that followed remains one of the most remarkable stories of military adaptation in modern history. It explains why professional German soldiers who had spent years fighting British forces came to consider relatively inexperienced Americans the most dangerous opponents they ever faced. To understand why German soldiers came to fear Americans more than the professional British forces they had fought since 1940, we need to begin with what should have been the death blow to American military credibility. In February of 1943, Green American troops stumbled into their first major battle against veteran German forces at a remote mountain pass in Tunisia called Kasserine. The Americans walked into a disaster of their own making. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the Second Corps from an elaborate headquarters constructed approximately 70 miles behind the front lines. Engineers had spent 3 weeks building this underground bunker complex, while Fredendall's troops occupied exposed positions across a wide front with no coherent defensive plan. General Eisenhower himself later wrote in his memoir Crusade in Europe that this was the only time during the war that he ever saw a divisional or higher headquarters so concerned over its own safety that it dug itself underground. Shelters. The general rarely visited his forward units and communicated in a confusing private code that left subordinates guessing at his intentions. His forces were scattered and unprepared. The 168th Infantry Regiment received 450 new replacements just days before the German attack. Many of these men had never been through basic training. Some arrived at their units without rifles. Bazookas, the American infantry's primary anti-tank weapon, reached the front line on February 12th, just 2 days before the German attack began. On February 14th, 1943, the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck at Sidi Bouzid. The result was a complete rout. American tanks attempting to counterattack were destroyed piecemeal by German forces operating with superior coordination and firepower. Infantry positions crumbled under the combined assault of armor and close air support. By the night of February 16th, Second Corps had lost approximately 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. Communications broke down. Units retreated without orders. Panic spread through rear area headquarters. Over the following week, American forces retreated almost 50 miles in chaos and confusion. Rommel's panzers pushed through Kasserine Pass itself on February 20th, threatening to split the Allied front and capture vital supply depots. Total American casualties reached approximately 6,300 men against fewer than 1,000 German losses. It was a humiliating defeat that seemed to confirm every German assumption about American military incompetence. German soldiers who fought at Kasserine remembered the experience with contempt. American officers seemed unable to coordinate their forces. Artillery support was haphazard and poorly directed. Infantry units broke and ran when German armor appeared. It seemed obvious that these amateur soldiers from across the Atlantic posed no real threat to the experienced Wehrmacht. But something strange happened in those final days of the Kasserine battle. As German forces pushed through the pass and drove toward American supply depots near Thala and Tebessa, they ran headlong into stiffening resistance that had not been there days before. American artillery, badly coordinated at first, began to find its rhythm. Reserves that had been scattered uselessly across the front started concentrating at critical defensive points. The German advance slowed, then stopped, then began to reverse. Rommel had expected to exploit a complete breakthrough. His plan called for driving through the western dorsal mountain range and threatening the entire Allied position in Tunisia. Instead, he found himself facing an enemy that was learning to fight even in the middle of losing the battle. The Americans had been beaten badly, but they had not broken. They had started adapting even as shells were still falling. What happened next shocked German commanders who thought they understood their new enemy. Within days of the Kasserine disaster, General Dwight Eisenhower conducted a brutal assessment of what had gone wrong. He identified failures in leadership, training, coordination, and doctrine. Most importantly, he acted on what he learned. Fredendall was quietly relieved of command and sent back to the United States, where he spent the rest of the war training troops stateside. The army did not simply blame individuals. It examined its own systems and found them wanting. On March 6, 1943, Major General George Patton arrived to take command of 2nd Corps, replacing the discredited Fredendall. The change was immediate, dramatic, and merciless. Patton found an army in disarray. Officers stayed far from the front lines where they might face danger. Discipline was casual, with soldiers ignoring uniform regulations and basic military courtesy. Units fought as scattered fragments instead of coordinated combined arms formations. Communication between infantry, armor, and artillery was sporadic at best. Patton issued orders that terrified his own staff almost as much as they worried the Germans. He demanded that officers get to the front lines where they could see the fighting and lead their men. When Major General Orlando Ward mentioned that 1st Armored Division had the good fortune of not losing any officers that day, Patton erupted. According to accounts published in military history journals, he told the general that was not fortunate, that was bad for the morale of the enlisted men. He made clear he wanted officers taking risks alongside their troops. Patton reorganized units to fight as combined arms formations with infantry, armor, and artillery working together as coordinated teams. He established clear chains of command and enforced brutal discipline. He demanded that every operation be supported by maximum available air power. The transformation was not subtle, it was not gradual. It was a complete overhaul of how 2nd Corps operated, accomplished in a matter of weeks by sheer force of will. On March 23, 1943, just 6 weeks after the Kasserine humiliation, the 10th Panzer Division launched an attack near the town of El Gheta in central Tunisia. This was the same German unit that had torn through American positions at Kasserine. The division commander, General Major Friedrich von Broich, assembled approximately 6,000 men with 50 operational tanks, a company of tank destroyers, and an assault gun battery. The Germans expected another easy victory against the amateur Americans. At 6 in the morning, 50 German tanks emerged from a mountain pass into the El Gheta Valley. They advanced in a formation with tanks and armored vehicles forming a three-sided screen, supported by motorized infantry in half-tracks and motorcycle sidecars. Artillery remained at the start line, firing over the advancing armor. The formation swept forward, quickly overrunning American frontline infantry and artillery positions that stood in its path. 2 German tanks approached so close to the headquarters of the American 1st Infantry Division that staff officers urgently suggested the commanding general should withdraw to a safer location. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen refused to move. According to accounts preserved in unit histories and cited by military historian Rick Atkinson, he responded with words that became legendary among American troops. He said he would like hell pull out, and he would shoot the first bastard who did. The German attack had covered about half the distance to El Geta when it hit an American minefield. 8 tanks were destroyed immediately, their tracks blown off or hulls breached by the buried explosives. The panzer formation's momentum faltered as crews tried to navigate around the obstacle. American artillery forward observers with portable radios called in concentrated fire from multiple batteries. Tank destroyers of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, positioned in concealed locations, opened up on the stalled German armor. By 9:30 in the morning, the Germans had lost 30 tanks and were retreating back toward the mountain pass. The attack that was supposed to sweep away the Americans had been stopped cold within 3.5 hours. That afternoon, American signals intelligence intercepted German radio traffic, revealing plans for a second assault scheduled for later in the day. This time, the Americans were waiting and ready. When German infantry advanced in the late afternoon, supported by surviving armor firing from the rear, American artillery employed devastating techniques that had been practiced extensively at training ranges back home. Gunners used airburst shells that exploded above the advancing infantry, showering them with shrapnel. They massed fires from multiple batteries using the time-on-target technique, with all shells arriving simultaneously to prevent enemy soldiers from taking cover. For the first time in the entire war, American forces had stopped a full-scale attack by a German panzer division and then launched successful counterattacks of their own. The transformation from Kasserine to El Geta had taken less than 2 months. German commanders noticed something deeply disturbing about this rapid recovery. The Americans were not just learning from their mistakes through individual initiative. They were institutionalizing their lessons and spreading successful techniques across the entire army faster than any military organization the Germans had ever encountered. The United States Army had built something no other fighting force in the world possessed in the same systematic way. They called it the Fire Direction Center, a system developed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the late 1920s and early 1930s by officers including Major Carlos Brewer and Major Orlando Ward. This method allowed artillery batteries to mass fires on targets with unprecedented speed and coordination through centralized calculation of firing solutions. The genius of the American artillery system lay in its flexibility and responsiveness. A forward observer equipped with a portable radio could call in battalion fire within approximately 3 minutes of identifying a target. The observer did not need to calculate range and direction himself. He simply reported the target location, and the Fire Direction Center computed firing solutions for every available gun. If the target warranted more destruction than a single battalion could deliver, the request could be elevated through division and corps artillery headquarters, potentially bringing hundreds of guns to bear on a single point within minutes. But the technique that truly terrified German soldiers was something called time on target. American artillery commanders calculated their firing solutions so that shells from multiple batteries, located at different distances and firing angles, would all arrive at the same point within 3 seconds of each other. There was no warning. German soldiers could not hear approaching shells and take cover before the impact because all the shells arrived simultaneously. One moment, the front line was quiet. The next moment, hundreds of explosions were detonating simultaneously across German positions. The numbers behind this artillery system were almost incomprehensible to German commanders struggling with chronic ammunition shortages. A single American infantry division fielded 48 artillery tubes, including 36 105mm howitzers and 12 heavier 155mm howitzers. The heavier guns gave American divisions substantially greater destructive power per round than comparable German formations. During critical battles, Americans could concentrate firepower that absolutely dwarfed anything the Germans could match. At the defense of Elsenborn Ridge during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, more than 300 heavy artillery pieces were concentrated behind American infantry positions. On December 22nd alone, these guns expended more than 10,000 rounds. At the 9th Army crossing of the Rhine River in March of 1945, 2,070 American guns delivered approximately 1,000 rounds per minute during the preliminary bombardment, firing over 65,000 rounds total. Rommel acknowledged this disparity directly in his reports from the front. He noted that the Americans showed great superiority in artillery, and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. In a later assessment, he wrote that the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, had broken the front open and made sustained defense impossible. But artillery was only part of what made American forces so dangerous to German soldiers. The Germans coined a specific term for their greatest fear on the Western Front. They called it Jabotod, meaning death by Jagdbomber or fighter bomber. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt became the primary instrument of this terror. These massive American fighters flew more than 545,000 combat sorties during the entire war. They delivered over 132,000 tons of bombs on German targets, while maintaining a remarkably low loss rate of just 0.7% per mission. From D-Day to the final German surrender, Thunderbolt pilots claimed destruction of tens of thousands of railroad cars, locomotives, armored vehicles, and trucks. Even accounting for the inevitable exaggeration in pilot combat claims, the destruction of German ground forces and logistics was absolutely staggering. The air superiority gap over Normandy reached ratios that seemed mathematically impossible. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, the Allies flew over 14,600 individual sorties. The Luftwaffe had fewer than 320 serviceable fighters in all of France, and could only mount a fraction of that number in actual missions. German pilots faced overwhelming odds every time they took off. The production disparity between American and German factories made any hope of recovery completely impossible. The United States alone built approximately 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Germany's peak annual production reached roughly 39,800. Total American wartime aircraft production exceeded 295,000 machines. Germany produced approximately 116,000. The human cost to the Luftwaffe pilot corps was equally devastating and unsustainable. Between January and May of 1944, over 2,200 German fighter pilots died in combat. In May of that year alone, 25% of Germany's entire fighter pilot force was killed. Monthly fighter losses ran between 43 and 56% of available aircraft strength. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat were being killed faster than new pilots could be trained. German ground forces learned to dread clear skies with a visceral fear that shaped every tactical decision. Any daytime movement on roads attracted immediate air attack from prowling fighter bombers. Truck convoys had to move only at night. Armor formations took hours to cover distances they could have crossed in minutes without the constant threat from above. The knowledge that American aircraft could appear at any moment paralyzed German logistics, forced exhausting night movements, caused massive fuel consumption through constant detours, and prevented timely reinforcement of threatened frontline positions. Yet for all their firepower advantages in artillery and aircraft, American forces still faced problems that technology alone could not solve. In June and July of 1944, American troops found themselves trapped in the Normandy Boscage. This ancient French landscape of hedgerows presented obstacles that planners had not adequately anticipated. The Boscage consisted of fields surrounded by earthen mounds 4 to 15 feet high, covered with centuries-old root systems that had grown into virtually impenetrable walls of vegetation. Each field was essentially a natural fortress. Tanks could not climb the embankments without exposing their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank weapons waiting on the other side. The few gaps in the hedgerows were pre-sighted by German machine guns and Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. A handful of German soldiers with automatic weapons could halt entire American battalions trying to advance from field to field. The fighting in the Boscage was nightmarish. American infantry had to clear each field individually in costly frontal assaults. Tank support was nearly useless because armor could not move through the hedgerows. Artillery could not see targets hidden in the enclosed fields. Between certain villages, American forces suffered approximately 1,000 casualties for every kilometer of advance. At this rate, it would take years to break out of Normandy. What happened next demonstrated precisely why German soldiers came to find Americans uniquely dangerous despite their lack of European military tradition. Across the American sector, individual units began independently developing solutions to the hedgerow problem. Engineers experimented with explosives. tankers tried different approaches to breaching the walls. The most famous solution came from an unlikely source that embodied everything that made the American military different from its European counterparts. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Coolin III served with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, which was assigned to 5th Corps under 1st Army. He came from Cranford, New Jersey, a small town where he had worked before the war. According to military historian Max Hastings in his book Overlord, the original idea for a hedgerow solution came from an ordinary soldier, a Tennessee man named Roberts, who suggested during a discussion about the problem that they should put saw teeth on the front of tanks to cut through the hedges like a saw cutting through wood. While other soldiers laughed at this seemingly naive suggestion, Coolin recognized the fundamental soundness of the idea and began working on a practical implementation. Coolin later attempted to give Roberts credit for the original concept, but this was forgotten in the publicity surrounding the invention. The device Cullen created was elegantly simple in concept but brilliant in execution. 4 steel prongs were welded to the front hull of a Sherman tank, fabricated from scrap steel salvaged from the German beach obstacles called Czech hedgehogs that had been scattered across the Normandy beaches. When a tank equipped with these prongs drove into a hedgerow, the teeth bored into the earthen wall and pinned down the tank's belly, preventing it from riding up over the obstacle. The Sherman could then smash straight through the hedgerow under a canopy of dirt and roots, emerging on the other side with guns ready to engage the enemy. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched a demonstration of this device. In his memoir A Soldier's Story, Bradley described watching in awe as a hedgerow exploded to make way for the Sherman tank bursting through the other side. He immediately ordered mass production of the hedgerow cutters. Work proceeded around the clock under camouflage netting to maintain secrecy from German aerial reconnaissance. By the launch of Operation Cobra on July 25th, just 11 days after Bradley's demonstration, 3 out of every 5 tanks in 1st Army were equipped with what became known variously as the Cullen hedgerow cutter, the Rhino device, or simply the Cullen cutter. Over 500 of these devices were manufactured in that brief window. General Eisenhower later recalled that the biggest and happiest group in all the Allied armies that night were those who knew this device worked. Cullen received the Legion of Merit for his invention that helped break the Normandy stalemate. Several months later, he stepped on an anti-personnel mine in the Hurtgen forest near the German border and lost his left foot. His invention remained in use until the end of the war. The story of Sergeant Cullen exemplified why German professional soldiers found Americans so dangerous despite their relative inexperience. In the German army, a sergeant would never have been encouraged to develop tactical innovations on his own initiative. Such matters were left to officers and military engineers. In the rigid British Army, the suggestion would have been forwarded through proper channels and studied by committees. But in the American Army, a sergeant from New Jersey could take an idea from a Tennessee private, build a prototype in a field repair shop, demonstrate it to a commanding general, and see it deployed across an entire army in less than 2 weeks. Operation Cobra itself demonstrated what American forces could accomplish when their full firepower was brought to bear on a concentrated objective. On July 25th, approximately 1,800 heavy bombers were dispatched, with roughly 1,500 effectively dropping more than 3,000 tons of bombs on a target area 4 miles long and less than 2 miles deep west of the town of St. Lo. Additional strikes from medium bombers and fighter bombers added almost another 1,000 tons to the concentrated devastation. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's best-equipped armoured formations, took the brunt of this overwhelming aerial attack. The bombing killed an estimated 1,000 German soldiers and destroyed command posts, tanks, artillery pieces, and communications equipment. Entire units simply ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. A tragic friendly fire incident during Operation Cobra killed 111 American soldiers and wounded nearly 500 more. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, who was observing the attack from a forward position. He remains the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre. But the tactical success was undeniable. By July 27th, the German 7th Army reported 7 separate ruptures in its defensive line that could not be repaired. Over 100,000 American combat troops poured through a gap not 5 miles wide in what became an unstoppable flood. By August 1st, General Patton's Third Army was officially activated, and the breakout from Normandy was complete. The boskage that had cost so many American lives became strategically irrelevant within days, as armoured columns raced across open French countryside. This pattern of setback, followed by rapid adaptation, followed by overwhelming success, repeated throughout the American experience in World War II. But nowhere was it more dramatic or more consequential than in December of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army, with over 600,000 American soldiers eventually engaged across the frozen forests and villages of Belgium and Luxembourg. When more than 200,000 German troops launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes on December 16th, the American response at critical defensive points shattered the German timetable and transformed a potential catastrophe into what Winston Churchill would call, undoubtedly, the greatest American battle of the entire war and an ever-famous American victory. At Elsenborn Ridge on the northern shoulder of the German penetration, the untested 99th Infantry Division and the veteran 2nd Infantry Division held their positions against Hitler's best-equipped armoured units. The 6th Panzer Army spearheading the main attack included elite Waffen-SS divisions personally selected by the Führer himself for the decisive breakthrough that would split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck Jr. commanded the 18-man Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, along with 4 artillery forward observers who joined their position. When German forces attacked on December 16th, this small unit of 22 men found itself facing an entire German parachute battalion of roughly 500 soldiers from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. Bouck's men held their positions through hours of continuous fighting, inflicting approximately 92 casualties on the attacking Germans and delaying the advance of Kampfgruppe Piper, the armoured spearhead of the offensive. This small unit later became the most decorated American unit of its size in the entire Second World War. Behind the infantry positions at Elsenborn Ridge, more than 300 artillery pieces concentrated their fires into a wall of exploding steel that made the ridge approaches virtually impassable for attacking German forces. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army on the southern attack route, later admitted that the German counter-offensive failed because their right flank near Monschau ran its head against a wall it could not break. At the vital road junction of Saint-Vith, the 7th Armoured Division under Brigadier General Bruce Clark held for nearly a week against overwhelming German forces, throwing the German offensive timetable into great disarray. Eisenhower later called the defense of Saint-Vith a turning point of the entire battle. But the most famous American stand of the Bulge came at Bastogne, a small Belgian crossroads town that controlled access to the main road network through the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The 101st Airborne Division rushed to Bastogne from camps in France, and elements of the 10th Armoured Division found themselves completely surrounded and outnumbered roughly 4-1 by German forces. The American defenders lacked adequate winter clothing, were running short of ammunition, and had no way to evacuate their wounded. On December 22nd, German officers under a flag of truce approached American lines southeast of Bastogne. They carried a written ultimatum from the German Corps commander. "The fortune of war is changing," it read. "Battalions are ready to annihilate the American troops in and near Bastogne." The message demanded surrender within 2 hours, or face total destruction, and warned that all civilian casualties from the resulting artillery bombardment would be the responsibility of the American commander. The German delegation was taken blindfolded to an American command post where the message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander, while Major General Maxwell Taylor was attending a conference in Washington. According to multiple witnesses in the command post, McAuliffe read the German ultimatum, crumpled the paper into a ball, tossed it in a wastebasket, and muttered a single dismissive word. When his staff tried to draft a formal diplomatic reply to the surrender demand, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard suggested that the general's initial reaction summed up the American position perfectly. The official reply, typed on a single sheet of paper and delivered to the waiting German officers by Colonel Joseph Harper, contained exactly one word in capital letters: Nutz. When the puzzled German delegation asked if this constituted a favorable or unfavorable response, Colonel Harper clarified the American position in plain language. He told them that if they did not understand what nuts meant, in plain English, it was the same as telling them to go to hell. The 101st held Bastogne against repeated armoured and infantry attacks over the following days. On December 26th, after a siege lasting more than a week, elements of General Patton's Third Army broke through German lines from the south to relieve the surrounded garrison. Patton's relief of Bastogne represented one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers of the entire Second World War. His Third Army had been attacking eastward into the German Saar industrial region when the Ardennes offensive began. At the Verdun conference on December 19th, Patton promised Eisenhower he could extract 3 divisions from combat, wheel them 90 degrees to the north, and attack within 48 hours. On December 26th, the 4th Armoured Division reached Bastogne, with the tank nicknamed Cobra King making first contact with the defenders. Military historians have studied this maneuver for decades, trying to understand how any army could accomplish such a feat in such limited time. The answer lay in Patton's characteristic preparation for all contingencies. Anticipating that something might go wrong somewhere along the Allied front, he had already developed contingency plans for turning his forces north. When the call came, his staff simply executed plans that were already in preparation. By mid-January of 1945, the bulge was eliminated, and American forces were pressing back toward the German frontier. The human cost of the battle was staggering on both sides. Approximately 19,200 Americans were killed, and total American casualties reached roughly 80,000. German losses were equally devastating, with an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 total casualties plus hundreds of tanks and assault guns that the collapsing German war economy could never replace. Why were the Americans able to recover from surprise and defeat so quickly and so consistently while German forces, despite initial tactical success, could not sustain their momentum? The answer lay in fundamentally different organizational philosophies that shaped how each army learned, adapted, and improved. The United States Army had built a systematic feedback loop that no other military organization in history had matched for speed and comprehensiveness. The Army Ground Forces published training bulletins including combat lessons, rank and file in combat, and battle experiences that rapidly disseminated frontline innovations across all theaters of operation. Observer teams regularly inspected combat units and reported on what worked and what failed. This information flowed back to training commands in the United States, where programs were continuously adjusted based on actual combat experience. The speed of this adaptation was remarkable. Replacement training cycles were adjusted repeatedly based on battlefield reports. Training that had been 13 weeks before Pearl Harbor was compressed to 8 weeks immediately after the attack to meet urgent manpower needs, then expanded to 17 weeks by August of 1943, when combat experience revealed that rushed training produced excessive casualties, then adjusted again to 15 weeks during the Bulge crisis, when replacements were desperately needed. Each adjustment reflected lessons learned from actual combat, not theoretical doctrine developed in peacetime classrooms. The contrast with German training was stark. While American programs evolved continuously based on frontline feedback, German replacement training deteriorated steadily as the war progressed. By 1944, German replacements often arrived at the front with just weeks of instruction, sometimes without ever having fired their assigned weapons. The institutional learning that made American forces progressively more effective was simply absent in the collapsing German military system, where Americans sent observer teams to the front and published lessons learned bulletins within weeks. German units hoarded successful tactics locally and punished officers who admitted failures rather than studying them. When Sergeant Coulin invented his hedgerow cutter in Normandy, the concept was evaluated, approved, mass-produced, and deployed across an entire army in less than 2 weeks. When American infantry proved vulnerable to German tank attacks in Tunisia, new anti-tank tactics were developed, tested, and distributed to units worldwide within months. The American system was designed from the ground up to learn from failure rather than to punish or conceal it. The British Army took a fundamentally different approach to warfare. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the most influential British commander of the war, had been deeply affected by the horrific casualties of the First World War and the disasters of early British campaigns in North Africa. His doctrine emphasized set-piece battles with overwhelming force, meticulous planning, and tight central control of operations. British attacks were carefully coordinated and thoroughly supported, but they were also slow and predictable. This approach made British operations effective and minimized casualties, but it also meant German defenders usually knew what to expect. German officers who had fought the British for years understood their methods and could anticipate their moves. The British were dangerous, but they were dangerous in familiar and manageable ways. A German commander facing Montgomery could predict with reasonable accuracy when and where the British would attack and how they would conduct their operations. The Americans offered no such predictability. The German army, meanwhile, was systematically destroying its own greatest competitive advantage. The Wehrmacht had built its tactical excellence on a concept called Auftragstaktik, usually translated as mission-type tactics. This doctrine gave subordinate commanders extraordinary freedom to improvise and adapt their methods as long as they achieved assigned objectives. A German battalion commander facing an unexpected situation did not need to request permission from higher headquarters before adjusting his approach. He was expected to use his judgment and initiative. This flexibility had made German forces the most tactically effective army in the world during the early years of the war. German units routinely outmaneuvered and outfought larger Allied formations through superior initiative and adaptation at the small unit level. But Hitler's increasing interference in military operations systematically strangled this flexibility. His December 1941 halt order, forbidding any retreats during the Soviet winter counter-offensive, marked the beginning of a pattern that would cripple German military effectiveness. By 1943 and 44, blanket no-retreat orders eliminated initiative at every level of command. Talented commanders who argued for tactical withdrawals were dismissed or worse. Ideological loyalty to National Socialism replaced military competence as the primary path to advancement. German units that could have adapted to changing situations found themselves frozen in place by rigid orders from a headquarters hundreds of miles away, commanded by a man who had not visited the front lines in years. The production gap underlying American advantages was almost incomprehensible to German soldiers and commanders who faced American forces. The United States alone produced approximately 295,000 aircraft during the entire war. American factories built roughly 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. They manufactured over 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition and approximately 1 billion artillery rounds. They turned out over 2 million military trucks that kept Allied forces supplied across 3 continents. The scale of American logistics support was equally staggering. The famous Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that kept Allied forces supplied after the Normandy breakout, operated with approximately 6,000 trucks at its peak, delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies daily to advancing combat units. African-American soldiers, comprising roughly 3/4 of the Red Ball drivers, kept this critical supply line operating around the clock despite exhaustion, enemy air attacks, and roads churned to mud by constant heavy traffic. American doctrine explicitly traded material for lives. Combat analysts calculated that American forces expended substantially more ammunition per engagement than any other army in the war. This profligate use of firepower was not wasteful extravagance. It was a deliberate strategy that produced measurably lower casualty rates than armies that conserved ammunition but spent lives. The American military had consciously decided that industrial output was more replaceable than trained soldiers. When an American infantry platoon came under fire, the instinct drilled into every soldier was not to close with the enemy through maneuver, but to call in supporting fires and let artillery and aircraft do the killing. When supplies ran short, Americans simply built more. When equipment was destroyed, replacements arrived within days. When tactics failed, new approaches were developed, tested, and deployed in weeks. The German military-industrial complex, crippled by Allied bombing and starved of raw materials by naval blockade, could not begin to match this output. This was the reality that made German soldiers fear Americans despite initially dismissing them as amateur soldiers who would fold under pressure from European military professionals. The British were dangerous, in the same way a skilled fencer was dangerous. You could study their techniques and develop effective counters. The Soviets were dangerous like a flood. They came in overwhelming numbers and absorbed casualties until something broke. But the Americans combined elements of both threats while adding something uniquely their own. They learned faster than any enemy expected. They adapted their tactics in the middle of ongoing battles. They produced and deployed new equipment at speeds that seemed physically impossible. They used firepower as a substitute for tactical finesse, burying problems under avalanches of shells and bombs, rather than trying to outmaneuver opponents. And most concerning of all from the German perspective, they never seemed to run out of anything they needed. When American forces took fire, they did not simply return fire and seek better defensive positions like professional soldiers were taught. They returned fire, immediately called in devastating artillery and airstrikes on the source of the enemy fire, and then attacked toward the enemy position as soon as the supporting fires lifted. They did not try to outthink their opponents or outmaneuver them through clever tactics. They tried to overwhelm them with superior firepower and relentless aggression. And they had the industrial resources to make this approach work consistently. This approach was not elegant. It was not subtle. It did not demonstrate the operational artistry that German staff officers had spent their careers perfecting. German commanders who had built their professional reputations on clever maneuver and tactical finesse found the American way of war almost offensive in its bluntness. But it worked. American forces ground their way across France, survived the Bulge counteroffensive, crossed the Rhine River, and drove deep into the heart of Germany using brute force backed by industrial might and institutional learning. The German soldiers' fear of American forces was ultimately not about individual combat skills or small unit tactics. By most reasonable measures, German infantry training produced soldiers who were technically superior in fieldcraft, marksmanship, and small unit coordination. German officers were often more experienced and more creative in their tactical thinking. German equipment was frequently more technologically advanced. But none of that mattered when American artillery could blanket an entire area with hundreds of shells arriving simultaneously with no warning. None of that mattered when any German movement by day brought fighter bombers screaming down from the sky within minutes. None of that mattered when every German tactical success was met by American reinforcement and counterattack within hours, before exhausted German troops could consolidate their gains. The lesson of why German soldiers ultimately found Americans more dangerous than the professional British forces applies far beyond the specific context of military history. It is a lesson about institutions, about learning, about adaptation to changing circumstances. The British Army was built on centuries of proud tradition and accumulated experience. It did many things very well because it had been doing them for generations. But those same traditions made it resistant to rapid change when circumstances demanded new approaches. The German army was tactically brilliant and operationally creative, but it became increasingly hamstrung by leadership that refused to admit mistakes, punished initiative, and demanded blind obedience. The American army was relatively new by European standards, comparatively inexperienced, and filled with soldiers who had been civilians just months before entering combat. But the American army built systems that turned failure into institutional learning rather than individual punishment. It created processes that spread successful innovations across the entire force faster than any competitor. It encouraged initiative from sergeants to generals and rewarded results rather than adherence to doctrine. The disaster at Kasserine Pass became a case study in what not to do, and its lessons were applied across the entire force within months. Organizations that learn from failure beat organizations that punish failure. Organizations that encourage initiative beat organizations that demand unquestioning obedience. Organizations that adapt quickly beat organizations that cling to comfortable traditions. These principles apply to businesses, governments, military organizations, and any human endeavor where competition and adaptation matter. German soldiers learned these truths the hard way across the battlefields of North Africa, France, Belgium, and Germany itself. They began the war completely convinced that American forces were amateurs who would fold under pressure. They ended the war genuinely fearful of an enemy that seemed to grow stronger after every setback, that possessed seemingly unlimited resources, and that never stopped advancing no matter what obstacles it encountered. Remember the transformation from Kasserine to Elgeta in less than 2 months. Remember Sergeant Curtis Cullen from New Jersey and his hedgerow cutter fashioned from German beach obstacles. Remember the single word that defined American defiance at Bastogne. Remember the German officers watching American artillery obliterate their carefully prepared positions with coordinated fires from hundreds of guns. Remember the Luftwaffe pilots who faced odds of 7-1 or worse every time they took off against the swarms of American fighters. That is why German soldiers, from privates shivering in their foxholes to field marshals studying maps in their headquarters, eventually concluded that their least experienced opponents on paper were actually their most dangerous enemies in practice. It was a lesson purchased in blood and fire across battlefields on 2 continents, and it remains relevant to any competition where adaptation, learning, and resilience ultimately matter more than initial advantages or established traditions. If you found value in this examination of military history and institutional adaptation, consider subscribing to join our community of history enthusiasts who explore the overlooked moments and forgotten lessons that shaped our modern world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other examples of rapid organizational transformation deserve more attention? Until next time, remember that the most dangerous opponent is often not the one with the most experience or the longest tradition, but the one who learns the fastest and never stops improving.
May 17, 1967. A concrete bunker buried deep in the frozen tundra of the Kola Peninsula. This is the nerve center for the Protivovozdushная Obrona, or PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces. Inside, the air is thick with the metallic smell of ozone and stale tobacco. Green phosphor screens cast a dim, sickly light on the faces of the officers. Their confidence is absolute. This is the impenetrable wall, the northern shield of the Rodina, the motherland. Their pride is built on a recent, monumental victory. Just 7 years prior, their new S-75 Divina missile system, known to the West as the SA-2 guideline, had done the impossible. It had reached up and snatched an American U-2 spy plane from the supposedly safe altitude of 70,000 feet. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured. The wreckage was paraded through Red Square. Soviet Premier Khrushchev had slammed his shoe on the desk of the United Nations, boasting that the skies over the Soviet Union were now sealed forever. For the men in this bunker, that victory was not just propaganda, it was a statement of fact. Their radar network was the most sophisticated on Earth. Their interceptor pilots, flying the new Delta-winged MiG-21, were sharp. Their missile crews were veterans, they were untouchable. A junior lieutenant, his face pale, leans toward his console. He blinks, wipes the screen, and checks his instruments. "Comrade Colonel," he says, his voice tight, "I have a contact. Bearing 290, Barents Sea." The colonel, a grizzled veteran of the Great Patriotic War, sighs. "A NATO probe. Scramble the duty flight. Let's give them a look and send them home." The lieutenant doesn't move. "Colonel, the speed. Look at the speed." A new plot appears on the main board. A single digital vector. It isn't probing, it isn't testing. It is moving with a velocity that the equipment itself struggles to comprehend. The plot updates. Speed, 3 to 1,000 kilometers per hour. A stunned silence fills the room. Altitude, 24,000 meters. "That is impossible," the colonel whispers. 24,000 meters. That was 80,000 feet. Higher than a U-2. 3,000 kilometers per hour. That was Mark III. It was not a bomber. It was not a fighter. It was faster than a bullet. The plots flash across the screen as the Phantom aircraft screams over the Soviet Union's most sensitive naval installations, the submarine pens of Murmansk. It is not evading. It is not hiding. It is simply too high and too fast to be caught. It is an act of pure technological contempt. Before the first interceptor can even reach 10 to 1,000 feet, the contact is gone, vanishing over the horizon into Finland. The room is left in a cold, heavy silence. The impenetrable wall had just been breached by a ghost. If you want to understand the true technological battles that defined the Cold War, subscribe to Cold War Impact. That single, terrifying blip on the radar was the culmination of an American nightmare and an engineering miracle. To understand the Phantom, we must go back to that same event that gave the Soviets such confidence, the downing of Francis Gary Powers on May 1st, 1960. For the United States, This was a strategic catastrophe. The U-2 Dragon Lady was their only reliable source of overhead intelligence on the Soviet missile gap. It was supposed to be untouchable, flying so high that no Soviet fighter or missile could reach it. The S-75 missile proved that assumption fatally wrong. President Eisenhower was caught in a public lie, the Paris Peace Summit collapsed, and the CIA's primary intelligence program was grounded. The U-2 was vulnerable. The need was immediate and absolute. Find a replacement. Find a way to fly higher and faster. The requirement was simple to state and nearly impossible to achieve. Create an aircraft that could not be intercepted. Not just difficult to intercept, impossible to intercept. The job fell to one of the most secretive and legendary organizations in American history, the Lockheed Skunk Works, led by the brilliant, demanding, and visionary chief engineer, Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson was a legend, the man behind the P-38 Lightning and the F-104 Starfighter. When the CIA came to him with this requirement, even he knew the scale of the challenge. The U-2 flew at the edge of the atmosphere. To be safe, its successor would have to fly there at the speed of a missile. The project, codenamed Oxcart, would operate at the absolute limits of known physics. At the target speed of over Mach 3 times the speed of sound, the air friction would heat the aircraft's skin to over 5 to 100 degrees Celsius. Aluminum, the standard for aircraft, would melt. The entire plane would have to be built from a metal that barely existed in the American supply chain: titanium. The challenge was immense. Titanium was brittle, notoriously difficult to machine, and its supply was almost exclusively controlled by the one country the plane was designed to spy on, the Soviet Union. In one of the greatest ironies of the Cold War, the CIA was forced to create a network of phantom shell companies and third-party agents to covertly purchase the raw titanium ore from the USSR just to build the fleet of spy planes that would render Soviet defenses obsolete. But the airframe was only half the problem. No conventional jet engine could survive those temperatures or speeds. The solution was the Pratt & Whitney J58, an engine that remains a marvel of engineering to this day. It was not a jet engine in the traditional sense. It was a hybrid, a turbo ramjet. At lower speeds, it functioned like a normal afterburning turbojet. But as the plane accelerated past Mach 2, a complex series of doors and bypass tubes began to open. The massive, movable shock cone at the front of the engine, the spike, would slide backward, managing the supersonic shockwave of air. This air would be diverted around the jet turbine and dumped directly into the afterburner, turning the entire engine into a monstrously powerful ramjet. The J58 was the only engine ever built that became more efficient as it flew faster. It didn't just tolerate the Mach 3 environment, it thrived in it. This rocket plane, as it seemed to the Soviets, was christened the A-12, a single-seat version for the CIA. Its larger, two-seat successor, built for the US Air Force, would become the icon, the SR-70, One Blackbird. It was cloaked in a special black iron ferrite paint designed to absorb radar energy and dissipate the terrifying heat. Its very shape was alien. The long, flat fuselage, the sharp chines blending into the wings, the twin-canted tails, all were designed, for the first time in history, to have a minimal radar cross-section. It was the world's first operational stealth aircraft, decades before the term became common. The pilots were a class unto themselves. They wore full-pressure spacesuits, identical to those worn by astronauts. They were not just flying, they were operating a reconnaissance platform on the black-purple curve of the Earth. From their cockpit at 85,000 feet, they could see the weather systems of entire continents and the slow, undeniable curve of the planet. They were, for all intents and purposes, America's first military astronauts, and their mission was to go where the enemy could not follow. We returned to the concrete bunker on the Kola Peninsula. The ghost has vanished, but the stench of failure remains. The colonel's face is granite. He is screaming into a telephone, demanding answers from the local interceptor squadrons. "What do you mean, out of range?" he barks. "What do you mean, target not acquired?" The pilots' reports are a confused jumble of disbelief. They had scrambled, punching their MiG-21 seconds into a maximum power climb, their afterburners tearing holes in the Arctic sky. They had pushed their aircraft to their absolute ceilings, their engines straining in the thin, cold air. But the target was never a target. It was a phantom. On their radar screens, it was a weak, fleeting return, climbing and accelerating at a rate that defied their training. By the time they reached combat altitude, The blip was already hundreds of kilometers away, a fading electronic echo. The Soviet High Command is furious. This is not just a failure, it is a humiliation. The PVO, the pride of the nation, the heroes who had plucked Gary Powers from the sky, had been rendered impotent. They had been exposed. The Northern Shield, the impenetrable wall, was a lie. An order comes down from Moscow, laced with paranoia and rage. The next time this unidentified object appears, it is to be destroyed, at any cost. All PVO districts are placed on high alert. Missile batteries are brought to full readiness. A new, desperate protocol is established. Interceptors are to be scrambled not on detection, but on prediction. Analysts begin to pore over the limited data, trying to find a pattern, a weakness, anything. They don't have to wait long. Several months later, the Phantom returns. This time, the target is the Baltic. The vector is unmistakable, streaking toward the heavily defended airspace of the Soviet Baltic republics. This time, they are ready. The system is on a hair trigger. "Target acquired!" A radar operator shouts, his voice cracking. "Speed, Mach 3, altitude, 25,000 meters. Fire!" From hardened silos across Estonia and Latvia, the S-75 Divina missiles, the U-2 killers leap into the sky on pillars of white-hot fire. They are climbing perfectly, a volley of massive 10-meter-long telephone poles racing toward the heavens at 3.5 times the speed of sound. In the PVO command bunkers, the crews watch their radar screens, their knuckles white. The missiles are tracking. The intercept solution is calculated. The target is fast, but the missiles are faster. This is the moment. The small green icons representing the missiles converge on the larger, faster-moving blip of the intruder. The operators brace for the flash, the explosion, the bloom of debris that would signify a kill. But there is no kill. The blip does not slow. It does not deviate. It doesn't even seem to notice. The missiles, reaching the apex of their flight, find nothing but empty, frozen air. They have been aimed at where the target was, but in the few minutes it took them to climb to their ceiling, the target was already 100 kilometers further on its path. They had fired at a ghost. The target, now designated by NATO as the SR-71 Blackbird, didn't even register the attempt. It simply continued, unwavering, on its mission. Inside the cockpit of that Blackbird, the view is serene. Major Robert Bob Gilliland, a Lockheed test pilot on one of the aircraft's first operational sorties, calmly surveys his instruments. His world is not the frantic, terrified scramble of the PVO bunker. His world is a calm, purple-black sky, a curved horizon, and the steady, deep hum of the J-58 engines. His defensive systems operator, or RSO, sits behind him monitoring the vast electronic landscape below. A small amber light flickers on his console. "Bob, I'm painting a search radar. Looks like a fan song," the RSO says, his voice flat, professional. "This is the targeting radar for the SA-2 missile system." A moment later, a new light. Launch indications. We have multiple birds in the air. In a normal aircraft, this would be a moment of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. The crew would be yanking the stick, dumping flares and chaff, diving for the ground. But this is not a normal aircraft. Gilliland and his RSO do not panic. They do not even flinch. They have a standard operating procedure for this exact situation. Gilliland's gloved hand rests on the throttles. He doesn't pull back. He doesn't dive. He pushes them forward. He accelerates and climbs. As the massive Soviet missiles claw their way up through the thicker atmosphere, burning through their limited fuel, the SR-71 simply pulls away. By accelerating from Mach 3.1 to Mach 3.2 and letting the aircraft drift up to 85,000 feet, the Blackbird's pilots could watch the missiles detonate harmlessly in the sky, far below them. They were not evading. They were outrunning them. They were watching their own intercept, from above, as a detached observer. The missiles, designed to kill high-altitude bombers, were simply not fast enough. Their guidance systems unable to compute an intercept solution for a target moving at nearly 1 kilometer per second. For the American pilots, it was a validation. For the Soviet missile crews, it was a moment of profound, soul-crushing shock. They had fired their best weapons. They had executed their doctrine perfectly, and it had all been for nothing. The intruder had swatted their missiles away not with countermeasures, but with pure, arrogant, unmatchable speed. It was as if a man with a musket had just tried to shoot a bullet. This was the new reality of the Cold War. The SR-71 was not just a reconnaissance plane, it was a psychological weapon. It wasn't just that it could fly over the Soviet Union, it was how it flew. It did not sneak, it did not hide in the dark. It flew in broad daylight, on predictable routes, at speeds and altitudes that were a calculated, deliberate insult. Every sortie was a message, broadcast to the entire Soviet defense network. You cannot stop us. You cannot reach us. Your best is not good in. The pilots of the Mi-21 seconds, the elite of the Soviet Air Force, were the ones who felt this humiliation most acutely. They would be scrambled, time and time again, on practice intercepts. They would see the contrail, if they could even call it that, more of a thin, ethereal shimmer in the stratosphere, and they would climb. They would push their red-lined engines to the breaking point, chasing a target that was always, just out of reach. They would return to base, their fuel tanks empty, their pride shattered. They were the guardians of the sky, and they were being mocked by a machine that operated in a different dimension. The word began to spread through the ranks. They were not chasing an aircraft. They were chasing Zhar-Ptitsa, the Firebird, a black mythical creature that lived in the heavens, untouchable by mortal men. The shock of that first encounter, that first failed intercept, did not fade. It calcified. It became a new, terrifying part of daily life for the Soviet Air Defense Forces. The SR-71 Blackbird was not a one-time experiment. It was now a fully operational system. The flights, which had at first been daring probes, soon became routine. They became operational sorties, and they were given names. The most famous, and the most infuriating for the Soviet High Command, was the Baltic Express. This was not a covert, sneaking mission. It was a milk run, a scheduled route. The Blackbirds would lift off from RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom, their twin J-58 seconds shaking the fields of Suffolk. They would refuel over the North Sea. And then, as they approached the Baltic, the pilot would push the throttles forward. The Blackbird would climb and accelerate, a black spear ascending to the heavens. It would enter Soviet-claimed airspace off the coasts of East Germany and Poland, then scream eastward, flying a long, lazy racetrack pattern that took it past the heavily defended installations at Kaliningrad, along the coastlines of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all the way to the approaches of Leningrad. For the PVO, it was a recurring nightmare. They knew it was coming. Their long-range radars would pick it up, the same impossible blip, traveling at the same impossible